Hey, I'm Jim Hutchison with JimOnLight.com. I'm here at the NAB show at the Sea Changer booth with an excellent friend of mine and fantastic lighting designer, T.J. Gerckens. T.J., I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I know that you have such extensive experience dealing with, and I mean this in the most nicest possible way, dealing with the base-up 360Qs, or the 360s and the 360Q axials and all that stuff. So when you take something that has such a superior optical power or lamp power like a VL3500 wash or spot, I think they're both fantastic. Right. Where do you place yourself as an artist? Again, I love talking to you about the art. Where do you put yourself in mixing those two sources? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you know, I may be atypical in my use of the 3500s and the spot and wash in that most of the shows I do, I don't want you to be aware that it's a mover. Gotcha. I don't do a lot of shows where they go, you know, make these great effects and stuff, because that's not the types of shows I'm doing.
Sure.
So my goal is to make you unaware that there's any difference. And so one of the things that I did with, especially the 3500 spots, that I was using sometimes as downlights, sometimes as specials, is one of the first things I did was took a moment and mixed the equivalent of Lee 203 in a source 4, which actually went a lot faster than I thought. And then I just saved that
Sure.
relationship. And I could keep popping back to it, and I did the same thing with Lee 103, which is one of my favorite colors.
Nice.
And so then I had that kind of repertoire of colors built that I could go back to. And I think when you watch the show, other than the fact that the 3500s were blasting through these windows in a way that no source 4s or no incandescent source is going to do, other than that, I don't think you would have been aware that they were HMI sources.
Wow. So one thing I think that is really important to talk about is the evolution of working with color. Like, as a teacher and dealing with in the university environment, trying to help students understand color and amber drift and high-powered sources, it really is hard unless you know a far background information. I mean, I think it's important all the way far back into flame and candles and oil. So how do you bring those things across? I mean, either dealing with an assistant relationship or a student relationship, or even as an artistic overseer. Like you've helped me a lot in shows that I've done for you.
Oh, thanks. Which are beautiful, by the way.
This guy. Tell me how you work that way. Tell me how you see color.
Color is the hardest thing, and I remember I assisted Theron Musser on a show back in the late 80s in Chicago. The first thing I wanted to ask her is, okay, Theron, what's the secret to color? Because to me, color is the single hardest thing. Most of the shows I work on, color is a very subtle thing. And, you know, the difference between a Lee 203 and a 202 is noticeable. You know, it's, and Theron was lighting the first production of Lost in Yonkers in Chicago, and the color was so sublime. It was just so beautiful. And I asked her, so Theron, you know, how do you think about color? And she looks at me and she says, color can't be taught. It's too intensely personal. I don't even know what to tell you about how I color things. And when I'm asked about it, sometimes I'm the same way, because it's such a personal thing, and it's such a difficult thing because it's relative. And this is one of the challenges that I have as a designer in the tech process and in the focus process, because one color sitting here against one surface is going to look very different when, of course, you put a contrasting color next to you.
Right.
And then when you take the two and run them on a dimmer, and I think it really becomes about experimentation. And color is, when I do a show, I agonize over the color. I mean, I sit up in my office at night with a mag light or a little light, little color swatches on the costumes, asking my wife, how's this one look? Does this one look good? I've sat out in the street trying to recapture sodium vapor in an incandescent source. And what's so funny is when we brought the lights up on stage, people say, oh my God, that looks just like the street. And I'm like, yes. And then last week in a magazine, I saw that some gel company had a whole line of gels that you were just announcing, trying to capture sodium vapor. It's like, where were you a year ago? But it's such a challenge to think about, because looking at it, you know, looking at any one color alone is irrelevant. It just really depends on how it's going to look, what it's going to be contrasted with, and what level it's going to be run.
Sure.
And one of my things I hate most about focus is when focus starts, the first light comes up and I think, oh my God, there's too much color in this. this is going to look horrible. Oh man, I've ruined the whole show, you know, and I'm all like, and then about halfway through, oh, yeah, this might work. And by the end of focus, I'm like, oh man, these are all too pale, because my white reference has shifted so far from one end to the other. And during tech, I'll often step out into a neutral light source and into daylight just to try to recenter my eyes. So when I go back in, I have a better barometer on it. But I would say that I do tend to work from a less color mode, using accent statements of color or a lot of color in backlights. And I do think that most of us as designers tend to work with colors that we have experience in.
Sure.
You know, I like to say I don't have a style. I like to say I don't have a list of favorite colors. But you know what? Pick up a plot of mine that doesn't have Lee 203, Lee 202, Lee 201. No, I'm sorry, Lee 103, and maybe R68 in it. It's probably not my show. On every show I do, I really try to throw in a few new colors. Try to experiment with things, work with new colors.
Sure.
Because you don't want to fall in that rut.
Oh, yeah.
Of only using the same exact darn colors. So, and that's been something that working with some of the Vari lights has been interesting with me on, is the ability to play with that. So,
I am so glad to have seen you again, TJ.
my pleasure.
Guys,
My
this is
pleasure.
TJ Gerckens, a lighting designer, freelance LD. I'm Jim Hutchison from JimOnLight.com, and I want to thank you for having me here at the NAB show at Sea Changers booth, and we'll see you next time.